Hello, hello. I am Sinner, and I am back with another book of the Nicomachean Ethics yet again. And this time it is book six, Intellectual Virtues. And I gotta say, I enjoyed reading this one, and I found it way more interesting than Justice, even though I was more curious about Justice. So maybe I just had a higher standard of what he was going to be talking about. But this one's way more interesting. It's, at least in my opinion, it's instead of talking about things that you could consider like moral or like dispositions, it's more concerned with in the mind, intellectual virtues, let's say. So it talks about the difference between wisdom and prudence and intelligence, intuition, and all different sorts of uh let's say mental uh virtues, right? Things that are mental, let's say skills. I feel like skills is a better way to describe this, or attributes. In the modern day, we wouldn't necessarily think of intelligence as a virtue, more so as a skill. But in the ethics, he definitely talks about these sorts of things as virtues. Same with wisdom and prudence and so on. And he sort of starts off the virtues by going over some of the things that have already been talked about. The first thing is, what is the right principle that should regulate conduct? Contemplative and calculative intellect. And that's just basically going over contemplative and calculative intellect is just establishing the difference between like dealing with things that are a matter of truth and falsehood, using philosophy and reason versus um, understanding of things in a more into intuitive sense, right? It's like the difference between deductive and inductive reasoning, right? Like if you know something's probably going to happen, that's that's inductive reasoning. But if you use your deductive skills, you can figure out what will happen. And yeah, there's a quotes in here that I think are pretty interesting. I like these two sentences, which is in both kinds of intellect aim at truth, but the calculative faculty aims at truth as rightly desired by the exercise of choice. That is part two of this little book. And he says, it follows that if the choice is to be a good one, both the reasoning must be true and the desire right. And the desire must pursue the same thing that the reasoning asserts. So he's going over, like, if you have a goal, right, and you're trying to reach that goal, um, then what matters is not just the goal, also your ability to achieve the goal and the fact that your method and the goal are in sync, which I agree with, frankly. And he also says, right and wrong are truth and falsehood in the same paragraph, which I think is very, very true. I I would 100% agree with the proposition that if something is not true, if it isn't asserting the truth, it should not be counted as moral. If you are promoting a delusion or some sort of falsehood in general, it's even if it's like harmful, in the short term, like it makes someone upset. I think undoubtedly uh, you should definitely pursue the truth anyway. And he goes over how he defines scientific knowledge, which I think is sort of like a funny thing coming from an ancient Greek because we have a very different understanding of scientific knowledge. His is more philosophic. But there's a quote in here I underlined. Everything that is of necessity in the unqualified sense is eternal. Um, I don't know why I underlined that, but I will say this about this little chapter, well, not chapter, paragraph. He sort of goes over this idea that like scientific knowledge is knowledge that can be undoubtedly determined as true or false, right? Going back to that idea of like the calculative versus the uh, other type, the contemplative versus the calculative. This is something that is undoubtedly, true. That's what he quantifies as scientific knowledge. Then he talks about art or technical skill. And he says that, this is the other type of knowledge that's sort of more intuitive and it does need to be productive, obviously, and truly reasoned. It can't just be random gobbledygook. But uh, at the same time, it's more, you can't like scientifically determine what will be beautiful. It's sort of more a game of chance. And then he talks about the difference between prudence and practical wisdom and the difference between intelligence and intuition. And this is another little underline that I thought was interesting. It follows that the first principles of scientific truths cannot be grasped by either science or by art or by prudence. I 100% agree, buddy. The idea that science is somehow uh, a self-justifying belief system, that you can use science to justify science, is completely ridiculous, in my opinion. And among people who aren't interested in philosophy, it seems to be a somewhat common belief that like science is somehow self-evident, which it obviously isn't if you think about it. So I underline that just because I agree with it. But in general, here he just sort of goes over with like prudence or practical wisdom and science. I mean, intelligence versus intuition. It's more of just like definitional argumentation. It's not really something that's very, profound, let's say. It's just going over the basics in a kind of benign way. And then he says political science is a species of prudence, which I agree with. And in this case, he's defining prudence as sort of like practical intelligence, right? So if you're prudent, it's about knowing what to do in particular circumstances or situations or how to achieve a particular goal. So in the case for political science, he sees it, if you've read the politics, he sort of sees political science as a means to an end, a means to the good, and he doesn't really concern himself with like adhering to a dogma or a particular utopian vision. You know, he's much more fluid and willing to say like, oh, well, in this circumstance, this is good, but in that circumstance, that's good. You know what I mean? And yeah, he talks about resourcefulness, and he's just basically saying that it's different from prudence slightly, but um, there's nothing really too crazy. And he says that like understanding as well isn't necessarily something that is scientific or like uh there's sort of like an intuitive element to it. And he mentions like elders may have a lot of experience and understanding, but they might not be able to justify their position, right? They might just not have a reason to believe what they believe, but it works and it's true. So he sort of gives you a little finger wag, be like, trust your elders, they know what they're talking about. Then he goes over um, judgment and consideration, and then he just talks about the various states of the mind, the value of intellectual virtues, and he sort of just goes over there that um, intellectual virtues are only good if the person's good because, yeah, it's just like it intellectual virtues help you come to an end, but they're not necessarily like good in and of themselves. And he talks about this weird like catch 22 where people who have intellectual virtues will be the types of people who will be moral because they'll have the ability to understand what is moral, but only the people who are moral can really have intellectual virtue because they're the people who are willing to accept the truth and these sorts of things. So it's a bit of a catch 22. And I also agree with that. Obviously, if you're one of those guys who's like very stubborn and proud and you're not willing to accept things for what they are, it's going to be very hard for you to learn and come to an understanding of anything. And yeah, there's not much else to say. He talks about cleverness and he talks about prudence again and how it's related to proper virtue. And he sort of talks about, uh, you know, prudence again being sort of similar to virtue, but implies that they're slightly different. And that's it. That's intellectual virtues. I am a sinner. Thank you for listening. I thought this was a much better book than the last one. I thought it was much more interesting. But that's all for today, and I'll see you later.